When Pastor Scott told me I was preaching on Joseph, I have to admit I was disappointed. Everyone knows that story. Haven't we all heard that story since we were young? Not much fun for a sermon, and maybe, like everything in the Old Testament, a little bit too intellectually challenging for me. And the story of Joseph is so long. I asked him via email, do I have to talk about this subject? And he responded, the guest preacher can talk about whatever verses they want to talk about, but that I would get 200,000 heaven points if I mentioned Joseph. Our Bible and Brew crew will understand what points mean to me, so Joseph it is. Now don't get me wrong. I was one of many people, I'm sure, who was very excited in my early 30s when I had a chance to go to Joseph and the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat musical, starring Donny Osmond. I went with some friends and we had great seats near the front. But I have to admit, going to the musical for me really had nothing to do with the Joseph story. It was all about seeing Donny Osmond. And he did look right at me during his performance. So as I reflected on the story of Joseph and his brothers, I had to admit this story is a lot deeper and a lot more meaningful than I initially wanted to acknowledge. And now another dilemma. What part of this story should I talk about? For instance, I could talk about vulnerability. Joseph made himself vulnerable to his brothers by sharing his dreams. In Genesis 37:7, Joseph discloses his dream to his brothers. Suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, and then your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf. Now, perhaps this wasn't spoken in the gentle, humble way it could have been. Joseph was pretty young after all. And we all know the brothers did not receive this as vulnerability, but arrogance. How many times have we appeared arrogant to other people? Or how many times have we not disclosed who we really are or something about ourselves because we didn't want to be vulnerable and we didn't want a negative reaction? That doesn't seem to cross Joseph's mind when he's sharing his dream. Then I thought I could talk about hatred. Chapter 37, verse 8 shows the brothers' response to Joseph's dream. Are you indeed to reign over us? Are you indeed to have dominion over us? And so they hated him even more because of his dreams and his words. The brothers hated Joseph. One reason was they perceived him to think he was better than they were. Haven't we all ourselves dealt with some of these human feelings of hate, or being less than, or feeling not as important as somebody else? We all want our words. We all want our dreams to be heard. But then I reflected a little more on this story and thought, is it really about favor? Is this story about favor? Joseph's father gave him a coat. It must have been pretty special and quite unusual. It seemed obvious that Joseph's father showed him favor. This gave the brothers another reason to hate him. Genesis 37:3 reads, Now Jacob loved Joseph more than any of his children, because he was the son of his old age, and he had made a long robe with sleeves. Jacob was sharing favor to one of his children over the others. With all those sons, why would Jacob choose to do that? We do see other instances in the Bible where favor seems a little bit more desirable than favoring one's child over another. Maybe the most famous indication of favor in the Bible, or at least my favorite, is Gabriel coming to Mary in Luke chapter 1, verse 28, when he says, Greetings, favored one, the Lord is with you. And what is favor, really? I think it's probably essentially grace. No earning of points, just grace, which we all receive from God. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not your own doing, it's the gift of God. Joseph had many gifts. He had gifts for leadership, being vulnerable. He had gifts of wisdom. He was a dreamer, but he was especially known for interpreting dreams. Joseph found favor with Pharaoh by interpreting the king's dream. Genesis 41:39, the king expresses his favor to Joseph by saying, "Since God has shown you all this, there is no one as discerning and as wise as you are." Joseph was only 30 years old at this time. And this story really is about relationships. What is it like to lose the relationships that you took for granted? Joseph most likely assumed that he would have the support of his brothers and his father forever. When the shock wore off and the reality set in, he must have mourned that loss. Loss is something we can all relate to, and loss comes in many forms. When Joseph not only lost his brothers, but his father who adored him, he must have experienced grief over those losses. In my life, I've lost some very special people, and I've experienced grief. This is one condition of the human being that we just all have to endure. We all grieve differently, but one thing's for sure, grief changes your whole life. I lost my grandparents who lived on the same farm as I did. I lost my father in a car accident. I lost my mother from cancer, and less than a year ago, I lost my sister from cancer. My son's best friend, who was greatly loved by all of us, was killed in a hunting accident. Some very good friends have lost their children. We can all list layers of grief and suffering that have changed and sometimes completely transformed our lives. Joseph knew grief. We can feel what Joseph felt when he was in the pit. Perhaps from ignorance or because it's easier, we all make assumptions that people who are important to us will be with us forever. If I had to guess, I would guess that Joseph made those same assumptions as a young boy wearing his beloved coat. We believe their love and support will be with us forever, and we allow ourselves to be vulnerable to those relationships. But as we all know, in the end, Joseph's trials, tribulations, grief, and loss eventually end in him being right hand to the king. Joseph's story is also about righteous decisions. Joseph refuses to succumb to adultery with Potiphar's wife, but he ends up in prison anyway, not because he made the wrong decision, but because the woman lied about him. Righteous decisions do not always end in the right result, at least in our eyes. But righteous decisions always end in God's intended result. We need to act on what is righteous, not on what we anticipate to be the better result for us personally. Hard work. This is also a story about waiting. Joseph waited 2 years in prison before he had the opportunity to interpret a dream for Pharaoh and find his way out. We have all had that opportunity for waiting, though most of us probably don't look at it as an opportunity. I've talked to Pastor Scott about this a few times on myself on this subject. We as a church remember waiting for a pastor. We waited a long time for Pastor Scott, and then God delivered. Right now, Mike and I are waiting for our first grandchild due Christmas Day. The waiting's never going to end. It just goes on forever. We want things to happen in our time, not in God's time. We have all known waiting. Joseph waited in prison hoping to be rescued. Joseph waited for a long time to see his brothers. Perhaps he didn't even know he was waiting for that moment. When his brothers do come, out of desperation and famine, he recognized them right away, though they did not recognize him until he announced who he was. In Genesis 42, verse 24, Joseph turned away from them and wept. But after reflecting on all these possible topics in the Joseph story, I thought, Why am I supposed to talk about this? Because I didn't really want to. And I think, what is it about this story that I'm supposed to learn? What am I supposed to learn from the Joseph story? And then I am so convicted. Because in our spiritual arrogance, and in my spiritual arrogance, in our waiting and in our vulnerability, and when we are thinking we are acting in righteousness, or that with our actions we believe that we have found God's favor, we must have found God's favor, heaven points, we probably think we're wise, like Joseph. We identify ourselves as Joseph, long-suffering, wise, been done wrong Joseph. And now we deserve glory for our suffering and for our righteousness. This is the year 2020, perfect vision, so I have to acknowledge my own eyes were shut to the realization that I'm not like Joseph at all. I am more like Joseph's brothers. We are all like Joseph's brothers. We sin and we make personal choices for our own benefit and for our own relief. So, if we're more like Joseph's brothers, then who does Joseph represent? Is it possible Joseph represents Jesus in this story? If you think about Joseph's actions and his life, he suffered as the result of his brother's transgressions. He was given authority and a position at the right hand of the king at the young age of 30. He has the opportunity and the ability to issue justice and judgment to his brothers. But instead, Joseph chooses forgiveness. Not because his brothers earned it. He does it because it's a righteous action. It's the right thing to do. Now, could I have made that choice? I'm not so sure. In fact, I'm pretty sure I would have made a different choice. We should aim to be like Joseph, and we should want to be like Jesus. When Joseph discloses who he is to his brothers, he says, "God sent me before you to keep many survivors alive. It is not you who sent me here, but God." It reminds me of Jesus in John 7:16 saying, "My teaching is not mine, but his who sent me." And in John 14:6, "No one goes to the Father except through me." We should aim high to be like Jesus. It may not be easy, and it's probably not even achievable, but we need to try. Jesus hates sin but loves us. Joseph got there. He worked on his gifts and talents, and when his opportunity came, he chose mercy and forgiveness. With God, mercy and forgiveness triumph over judgment. Amen.